Your seat the pen. Go like what else?
Of course. Seems that our mics are on. So let's start. Happy to start. Welcome everybody. Welcome for those of you online. We're hoping there'll be some of you watching online. This session is to really look at the why, the what, and the what next around environmental labelling and consumer transparency. And I'm joined by three brilliant panelists. We have Sally Smith, who's Chief Sustainability Officer for Upfield. We have Richard Saltzman, who's the Chief Impact Officer for EIT Food, and then Charlotte Bond, Global Food and Beverage Director Lead at Qantas. So just first of all, kind of teeing up the conversation then, why are we talking about environmental labelling? And for me, I think there are three reasons. We know that customers are increasingly wanting to know where and how their food has been produced. So we have a greater drive for traceability and transparency. The second reason is we also know that one of the barriers to the scale of the transition of the food system is lack of consumer pull in some areas. And we know from a systems change point of view that actually that lever of consumer pull is really important. And so labeling could help create that pull. And then the third reason, and this is probably a private hope of mine, which is that labeling could lead to a race to a top. We could actually see brands competing on how little carbon they have in their products, how brilliantly sustainable their products are. And all of this matters to me because I realize I haven't introduced myself. I'm Sally Wren. I'm the CEO of Forum for the Future. We are a sustainable development non-profit, really interested in playing a role in the acceleration towards, we actually used to say a sustainable future. We talk about a just and regenerative future now. We've pushed our ambition further. And one of our three transition areas is the food and ag system. So for us, labeling is one of those areas that's got such huge potential, but we haven't quite cracked it. And on the way here, I was reflecting on the fact that I think it was 17 years ago in the UK, I was involved in something called PAS 2050, which was the certification scheme for carbon label. Yeah, I am that old. And we put carbon labels on packets of Walker's crisps or potato chips if you're in the US. And funnily enough, nobody really knew what they were. So we have moved on. I did go into the Carrefour store on the way in, and the labeling is much clearer. It's much easier to see the comparison. But I think it's safe to say we haven't quite unlocked potential of environmental labeling. And what we want to do today is to explore where are we right now and how might we sort of take this whole area a little bit further. So that's why we're here. Thank you for joining us. And what I'd just like to do first, really, is just ask you all in turn for your view on labeling. Why do you think it's important? Where do you see the potential? What are the barriers that you see? You all represent quite different perspectives, and I'm going to go to you, Sally, first, if I may.
Yeah, thanks, Sally. Sally to Sally. This is going to be a little confusing. So from an Upfield perspective, so clearly we're a food manufacturer. We're a leading company when it comes to plant-based foods. And we know that plant-based foods have a fundamentally lower impact than their animal counterparts. And bringing that to life for the consumer is incredibly important to us to try and support that shift that we know is necessary, not just from a climate perspective, but from a nature, health, zoonotic disease perspective, to the fore in terms of that food systems transition. And so back in 2020, we set out our position on carbon labelling as a starting point. We see it as an important lever to be transparent to the consumer, clear about what our impact is. It holds us to account on improving as well and the choices that we make. But more importantly, it allows us to start to engage in a conversation about why our products are better in comparison to the planet. And we wanted to do that in a way that was best in class, fully transparent, follows the science, follows the highest standards that we possibly could, because to be credible, we have to do that. In the last 3 years, we set ourselves a target of trying to systematize doing it. So what you hear about labeling is that it's too costly, it can't be scaled, it's too complex, the standards aren't there. And we wanted to overcome some of those challenges and see if it was possible to genuinely think, well, what's it going to take to do that? So we set ourselves a little bit of a hairy ambition to put carbon labels on 500 million by 2025. And in July this year, we got target, and we're now on track to do that at scale and at pace across nearly 1 billion products in the next couple of years. So that's about the base entry point of just telling a consumer what the climate impact of this product is. Like on Walkers, does the consumer really understand what it is? Well, we know that notionally, if you communicate about it, there is a brand benefit in the transparency that comes from it. The notion that they might not understand it, but you're prepared to tell them notionally shows you're responsible as an organisation. But it doesn't necessarily shift behaviour at the scale or the pace that we would like to see and we would hope for, clearly. So how do we then use the information on a more comparative basis? So what we've been playing with and experimenting is the different ways in which you can use that label to communicate the benefit, the difference and the comparison between two products. And we've done that with comparative labelling. And now we're starting to see that pulling through into some of the campaigns that our brands are running, where you have a brand that is specifically interested in that shift in consumer behaviour, shifting from animal consumption to plant-based consumption, and how we can trigger that disruption in the system a little bit with some fun, amusing marketing to help support it. What underpins all of that front end of the fun amusement has to be real world, hard-coded, safe science about claims in line with what's required. But for us, there's a deep curiosity, I think, about how we utilise labels, not just carbon labels, but also wider environmental labels, to help shift consumption.
And I really like what you said about you're supporting the label on pack with sort of brand activation, other means of communication, because going back to my Walkers example, that was completely missing. I think there was a small attempt to do that, but there was no context within which people were looking at that label. Can you just give us an example of a brand in your portfolio that is doing that really well? Bring that to life for us.
Yes, I think there's probably a couple of examples. So some of you might be familiar with Violife as a cheese, a plant-based cheese. And when we looked at Violife product, core to the Violife proposition is that the taste. And so what they're trying to do with it is show, yes, the kind of gooey, oozy nature of a plant-based cheese and inspire people to try it, because that's the entry point for any consumer is, does it taste great? Does it do functionally what I need it to do? And can I afford it, right? Is it a price point that allows me to access this en masse, on scale? And ultimately, we want to inspire as many consumers as possible to shift, not just vegans, right? So one of Violife's strapline is, we're vegan, but you don't have to be. So how do you just create great food that inspires people to try it? And they ran a really interesting online activation behind their Better for the Planet claims, where we looked at multiple different varieties of Violife cheese, show the average better than, so 75%, I think is the number. Qantas might correct me, they ran the numbers for me. And to make sure that in the online activation on socials and on the website, we put the substantiation behind it. And then how do you provide tools and ways for the consumer to interact with it? So if I shifted enough of my diet, what would that take? So there's some of that. Flora Plant brand, which we've launched in the UK and in Europe, in European markets and in the US now, is using the comparative claim in different ways. So they're more playing to the notion of, I'm going to tell you the science to try and inspire you to shift, or I can tell you the more human accessible emotional story of what this brands and it stands for in order to help you think about the shift. So they're not taking a head on, it was X, it was Y, we provide that information, but they're more utilizing the notion of you can eat the plant and skip the cow, and that has benefits. So how do you use humor and a bit of humility and a bit of fun with the notion that there is still the information that underpins your ability to say that? So you can't say that, you can't make those claims unless you're a greenwashing organisation. We try very hard not to be, without the science that underpins it.
Great. I'd like to come back to greenwashing probably a little bit later, if I may.
Yep.
But Richard, tell us a bit more about your organisation. People might not necessarily know who you are. I didn't understand that you were the food version of Climate Kick. And just give us your. Are you anyway? I'd love to hear your view on labelling.
Yeah, sure. So, thanks. So we are EIT Food. We're Europe's largest food innovation community, and we are a community of organisations that is here to change the food system, specifically around lowering its carbon impact to get to a net zero food system, improving health through diet, and improving resilience and trust in the food system. All of which come together around an issue like labelling. And I think the kind of where we start from is what are the innovations that can act as levers of change to affect better outcomes in the food system. Now, labeling is the tip of an iceberg, really. I think we really need to think what's behind a label. And it's a distillation of just an enormous amount of information, process, concepts, data that you're trying to present or communicate in a word or two or an image. And it's a really difficult thing. We tend to focus on the label as the outcome. At EIT Food, we're really trying to push that back down the process and understand what's happening underneath that label. So it's also very much in a social context. We do a lot of work at EIT Food on understanding the consumer. We have a dedicated team running a consumer observatory. We survey around 25,000 people a year on their attitudes to food. And I mean, let's take a label. Let's take grades, right? In the UK, if you get an A, that's a good thing. An E definitely doesn't stand for excellence. But elsewhere, you've got a totally different social context. Now exams have changed in the UK. You get a 9, that's a good thing. But being a bad parent, I remember I hadn't paid attention to the new grades and my kids were coming home and telling me I've got 8s and 9s. And I'm thinking, this just isn't good enough. What the hell are you doing? And they changed the label. So now 1 is good and 1 is bad and 9 is good. So I think there's a social context to labeling, which we need to be really conscious of in a really social. Food is inherently intensely social. So labels, we need to be really careful with around universality, etc. There's a social context to the way people view a label. And there's also a downside of labeling. Look, before genes and age took its toll, I was a redhead. And being labeled ginger has a whole load of connotations, some of which are true, the ginger rage, but other things, you think about the way labels are used, you have to also think carefully about the downside of trying to simplify an incredibly complex topic into a word or two. I think the other thing is think of what are you trying to affect? So legislation, we talked about legislation for labeling. Ultimately, you're trying to affect a behavioral change. So your label is not, I mean, we're looking at it not to show people something, not just to present information, but as a lever of change. How do you, and what behavior, therefore, are you trying to affect? Probably all know, preaching to the choir here, that white goods labeling was really effective. So the energy labeling scheme on white goods, which is hugely simple compared to what we're trying to do in food. Basically, A is good, E is not good. And the purpose of that label was to put energy performance in the decision-making framework alongside brand, price, and function. And so it just added an extra decision into the mix, and it was immensely effective. But if you design labels without that understanding of what behavioral change are you actually trying to affect and understanding how consumers make their choices, you're going to have a great label, but bugger all difference at the end of the day in what food choices people make. And the last thing I would say, Sally, you mentioned carbon labeling a couple of times. We're really passionate advocates for environmental labeling. We're really worried this becomes a carbon problem, and food is not just a carbon problem. It's a broad sustainability problem, and we really want to see labels embracing that. But yeah, there's no denying that increases the complexity of the problem. So a single label or a single designation that is trying to articulate multiple dimensions of sustainability, let's aim for the stars on that one, because it is really important to go beyond carbon.
And just on that, can you give us, Richard, an example of a really good environmental label then?
Yeah.
Does such a thing exist at the moment?
Well, there are many good labels. We're working with an organization, Foundation Earth, who've started with a life cycle analysis. So the end outcome is a great label. What we think underneath that is the great science, really, really strong science, trying to use the PEF methodology and bring it all together on a common set of standards and pushing for standards. So a great label only happens when you've got great foundations of science, of standardized process, and of commitment to that process from the organizations who are coming through. There are lots of examples, but I think us as a community, if we work together to get common understanding of the science basis, of the standards, of the process that feed up to the label, actually we might find an environment where there is a diversity of labels that are understood in their social and food context, but they're built on the same set of standards and platforms. And that for us could be a great outcome.
So in other words, a sort of solid foundation backed by solid science, but then the expression of the label is context specific.
Exactly.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Charlotte.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. So I'm from Qantas, and Qantas is an environmental consultancy. So indeed, we've been working with Upfield for the past few years. But also in general, we specialize on helping companies transition towards what we call a planetary economy. So really like a space where they do business in line with planetary boundaries. So I very much am in line with the broader environmental topic and the risk around the climate tunnel vision that we've been seeing take place for quite some time. And I think, especially as we work a lot with consumer-facing companies, the topic of eco-labeling is a little bit everywhere. It's been very interesting. When you think about food systems, there is no world where that entire systems transitions without a consumer change of behavior in terms of consumptions. And so we know that the planetary aligned diet is not what we're eating today. So we need to nudge the consumer into more informed and better informed decisions when it comes to eating choices. And that's not easy, because at the end of the day, consumers, for different cultural reasons, for different personal preferences, do like certain types of foods more than others. And so it's an extremely complex topic, filled with subjectivity as well when it comes to the decisions and what we're pushing there. But what we're seeing is that it is a lever that needs to be acted upon. And so that's why the eco-labeling, environmental labeling, no matter what you call it at the end of the day, there's many names right now going out there, is really critical. And we've seen its benefit in the energy space, but we also even see the benefits now of environmental labeling in general. A study that was done recently showed that products with sustainability-related claims associated with them grew and gained market share faster than their counterpart products without it. So it shows that even if a consumer is not ready really to pay a premium, and that's what you're referring to, Sally, and like the pricing element needs to be there for scalability, they are ready to make more informed decisions based on sustainability and influence their choices. Now, that being said, it comes with a lot of complexity. Right now, we're seeing a boom of labels coming out everywhere that mean different things, that relates on different methodology. And we're starting to have a place where we risk consumer fatigue on those labels, and them starting not to believe anymore that these labels are meaningful and that they actually, mean something from a scientific standpoint. And so that's why I fully agree with you, Richard, that we need this standardized basis of science that is behind them. And no matter how they're expressed, that's one thing, but they need to be very robust and in tools and methodologies and databases that are used across the board and that are transparent, where consumers can trust that what is coming into it is important. And what we're also seeing is a lot of regulations coming up, discussions coming up. So even though at this point we don't see a pure on regulations really taking place, there are some in the fashion space in France that are starting to pop up. But this will have a huge impact. And companies also, so we've talked about consumers, but if you think about companies, to make it scalable, it needs to be a simple system that is harmonized across regions. Imagine if a company now has to go, and you've talked about billions of products, like that's the scale that we're talking about, has to go and assess billions of products across different methodologies for each of the different markets with different scoring systems. it's going to be completely impossible to achieve in a viable way for companies. So not only does it has to be harmonized for quality and credibility and consumer engagement standpoint, it has to be harmonized for the capacity of companies to even go at this. And so that's really the place that we've been navigating. We also have been discussing quite a lot with Foundation Earth, who's trying to have that harmonization going and trying to navigate that space as we go. But yeah, we're starting to really be in that space where a lot of companies are okay trying to do their own thing and pilot testing a lot of things, and then some others they're more like, okay, let's wait and see what's going on because it's shifting so much. So it's an interesting time to be in the field.
Great. Thank you for that. I just wanted to pick up on one thing you said a moment ago, which was the fact that consumers are maybe not understanding the label. Products with labels are really attracting kind of greater consumer preference. I'm just curious to know, is there any sort of geographical variation there? And I ask because at Forum, we work across multiple geographies and we do a lot of work in food, particularly food retail. And we definitely hear that consumers are at different places. So just would love to hear a bit more about where you're seeing that trend in particular.
Yeah, I would have to say on that specific study, I would have a hard time tell you exactly that. However, that being said, more broadly on consumers, we're definitely seeing a bigger trend in Europe. Like the European market, and especially Central Europe, has been driving the path. And we see it on other KPIs. Like we see, for instance, I mean, I'm originally from Belgium, so I track those KPIs quite a bit more on that country level. But we see a reduction in meat and dairy consumption in Belgium that we don't see in some other regions, for instance. So there's definitely Central Europe, because of the regulations as well, because of the consumer push is more advanced on these topics. I'd say in the US, it will depend from state to state. Like we see the coasts tend to be a little bit more advanced, the center a little bit more traditional in their way of consuming. And so we definitely see differences. And then you have emerging economies, yet another topic. And there can be also discussions on the availability of certain foods from the get-go. So I definitely see regional differences there.
I think it is really interesting what's happening in Europe, for sure. We work with some European retailers, and consumer behavior change is definitely slightly ahead of perhaps. I don't think there's a ahead or a behind, but it's different. There's a move there happening.
Sensitivity that is there for sure.
On the question of consumer, then back to you, Sally. The $1 million question: what do your consumers say about the label? What's the feedback you get? So you described a moment ago the fun campaign from BioLife. I actually buy that. I like their feta. I'm a vegetarian, but I love the feta. It's really actually
It's great in a salad.
Nicer
really
than other feta.
Yeah.
You don't have that kind of goaty smell to it. So I love that product. But I'm just curious to know, what feedback are you getting from consumers? Are you getting, oh, this is interesting, not really quite sure what it means, or this is super interesting, I'm calculating my daily carbon footprint and I understand my consumption of cheese within that, which was kind of the holy grail a long time ago. So just tell us a bit more about the feedback you get from consumers.
Yeah, I mean, I think the notion that any consumer is going to care that much with one individual product that it fits their whole existence, I think, is a goal that we're not necessarily trying to pitch for here. Fundamentally, when we look at what we've done over the last couple of years and what we've learned, is I think it's more important to speak to the emotional side through brand and the brand positioning and the disruption that can create. And the data becomes secondary from a brand perspective. I think what we're seeing as well is it's still very difficult to disaggregate in the real world what's really happening and driving consumer behavior, because you tend to be running campaigns that do multiple things at once. So associating brand growth with just that one individual factor is very hard, when at the same time what we're trying to do is place products in the dairy aisle instead of the alternatives aisle. We're also trying to upgrade and update packaging. So we're using paper packaging instead of laminate foil packaging around a paper product. So when you're relaunching a product and you've got multiple factors in that repositioning, what we can show is that repositioning is driving brand growth
Okay.
and driving volume. But we couldn't disassociate that one individual lever. We've clearly, like most marketing-led organizations, we do consumer testing of messaging to work out which message works, where there's clarity. And I can say it took us a very, very long time to land exactly the slightly boring wording of a carbon label on our pack, because the difference between climate impact, carbon footprint, trying to sort of unpick what a consumer would really understand from that language and keep it clear was not the most insightful amount of time.
Yeah.
It's really hard. It's really intractable to communicate that science in a simple way. And I think we see this as part of that journey to something more compelling and simple that has to be consistent, because just talking about climate is quite binary. But when we look at the climate claims we make, our principles that have been established with the support of Qantas make sure that we can only make a climate claim, and we will only use a carbon label, and we will only make a comparative claim if, when we look at all factors within a full life cycle assessment on balance with all of those uncertainties in the data that sit underneath it, we are overly confident that on balance that product is better. So when we're saying something on carbon, it's because we know it's also better on land use, it's also better on water, it's better on a multitude of environmental indicators. Because what we don't want to do is go, look, we're great on climate, and all of a sudden somebody says, well, what about these other issues? So the tool that Qantas has helped us build, that HEF-aligned, ISO compliant, full LCA, and every time we run a product, we run literally the full recipe for the country in which he operates. So it's not an EU claim, it's a country-specific claim. So if you pick up a pluck in the Netherlands, it's a comparison to butter or cream in the Netherlands versus what's happening in the country, or the UK or Germany or Poland. Any one of those countries, it's comparative. And the tool we have runs the full analysis. And I love the way that it does this. But if we can't make a claim, it just goes, no claim, doesn't give you an answer. So our marketers can't even get at. It might be 30% better, but our thresholds are very clear about what we're going to allow people to say or not. You're just not allowed to. We're just not going to give you the information so that we avoid that greenwash challenge.
I love that. Computer says no.
Computer says you can't make a claim on this, because you can only make a claim if we're absolutely confident that on balance across multiple factors it matters. And then the information that we provide to our brand teams isn't just the carbon number. So if they want to have a conversation in California on water, they've got the information to hand about what they can say about a product on water. Or if the debate about land and land use, the challenges about how we use nature come up, we've got the information about the land use footprint of those products specifically, and we can show the benefit of shifting that will free up land for other things in the food system if we can push, encourage, entice people towards plant-based products. But let's be clear, at the point of consumption, nobody really wants a lecture on land use or water consumption.
It's such a shame, isn't
They want to know it's really tasty, and it's somewhere underneath it, somewhere in their gut, that this is a good choice. So how do we help them feel like they're making a good choice?
So I think the important part there, it's not just a label, right? It's a label within a broader context of a brand activation. And I think that's a good learning that we've had over the last 2 years. But Richard, going back to you, and I would say I would love to come to you all in the audience if you have any questions in a moment. But my question to you, Richard, is how can we make this whole agenda accessible to smaller organizations? Because Upfield is a big organization, has access to the resources that can deliver the underpinning science. But of course, for any systemic change, we ultimately need SMEs and other smaller organizations to get involved. So what's going to be the mechanism, the process to kind of enable smaller organizations to get involved with this?
Yeah, it's always difficult for the SMEs to kind of get their voice above the noise, although there's a wormhole route through where it's not bad. I'm not getting into theory of relativity.
Oh, that's Introduce those
Yeah.
into the conversation.
People love superstars, and I think, Sally, you're talking really about the power of marketing and brand, which, as more of a spreadsheet person, is a dark art. I think you're right on the money here, that the power of stories and brand and success really does break through. So one route for SMEs generally is just for us who can put some of the superstars up on a pedestal and be unashamedly positive about that. And we've got the amazing privilege at EIT Food of working with a cohort of just incredible startups who do the most amazing things, and they do really clever stuff. There's a company called Agrain who make a non-dairy set of ingredients from spent grain from brewing that can be used as a direct substitute for dairy in products like ice cream, and it tastes bloody good. When I tasted it, it's like, I want this. It's just nicer than ice cream made from dairy. And so, I love talking about the startups that can do really amazing things like that. So number one, let's put a few of them on a pedestal and just show that you can stand alongside really big brands like Flora, whose no cow advert stares at me on my station when I go into London. It does make me smile. And secondly, we're looking at a food labeling alliance in Europe. It's something we spoke about in Brussels just over a year ago at our Future of Food conference. It's hard, right? Because a lot of the players have got different agendas still. But again, we have the privilege of working with some EU money. It's got some flexibility, and we believe it's an important thing to try to bring together an alliance. And how does this relate to small organizations? Because we can give them an equal voice within that alliance. And it's been very successful. One of our counterpart organizations in energy has been very successful doing this on battery. So they built the European Battery Alliance. It's really brought through the smaller operators, especially the kind of German small tech companies have been able to really influence the direction in battery technology. So give an individual voice, give a collective voice, and then frankly support those SMEs. And there's accelerators, there's money, etc. We can probably do that in a more structured way so that SMEs can have a greater say in how analysis, scoring, and labeling is used within their products, or they contribute to the process itself.
Yeah. I really like that because that feels very doable. Because oftentimes when you get asked, and I get asked questions, or how do SMEs get involved? And sometimes it's really hard because you're talking about organizations that might be 3 people and they're all doing at least 10 different jobs. But that's super clear, the power of storytelling, joining those alliances. That feels very doable, which is really great to hear.
Yeah, we hope so. And let's take Foundation Earth. They're 3 people so far, and they've made an enormous difference in this agenda through the collective efforts of those 3 things.
You don't have to be big to do well in this.
No, as proven by David several thousand years ago. But yeah.
It took me a microsecond that David and Goliath, in case you were struggling there. I had to take you back.
Top head, isn't it? It
Yeah.
catches you after a few days.
Pete, Charlotte, if I may, the sort of other end of that question. So you were talking earlier about the progress that's been made to enable brands such as those that sit within the Upfield portfolio to express a label on pack. In your view, as someone that I think you said you've been at Qantas for 8 years, you've been involved in this field for a while then, what are the next steps to mass adoption of labeling? What needs to happen next?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because at the end of the day, and I think it's an issue that we have across sustainability, scalability is the biggest challenge that we see in any kind of field for food system transitions. I think we need harmonization. We need a common framework that companies can align upon and where they can feel comfortable that they have a credible system that will speak to the consumer and that will not be just each company setting out their own system and having consumers going in one shop, seeing one thing, and in the next one, seeing something else. And so I think that that's one thing that is really important. And when I say harmonization and standardization, it's in terms of methodologies, in terms of what you were talking about, like the environmental indicators, the full life cycle assessments, so making sure that we talk about the same boundaries, and transparency. So making sure that the databases are out there. I mean, in our dreams, we could hope of even a tool that would be accessible to everyone, and that would help a lot the SMEs as well in going into that. But I think if at the minimum we had some agreed upon at the European level to start with methodologies, frameworks, and so on that have to be followed, this would help massive adoption. Because that's what we're seeing. Some companies right now, because they know some of that might come, are kind of cautious about, okay, do I go in? Do I do my own thing? Do I don't? What is it that I can do without having all the answers? And so what we're trying to work on with companies is how you get them ready for when that will be there.
Yeah.
There's a lot that we can already put in place in terms of tools, in terms of governance, because that's an entire governance. What you spoke about, Sally, it's the brand involvement, it's a lot of methodologies, IT, legal, it's a lot of things and departments that have to be involved. So there is a lot that they can do to be ready when those methodologies come out. And the other thing is we help them understand what the different methodologies that exist currently can look like for them. So understanding, Earth Foundation has been working on a couple of methodologies. What does that look like? What does the EcoScore in France look like on your products? What does some of the things that are tested in Belgium or in Spain or in the UK looking like? To understand also what are your star products already across all, and what are your, problem child, for instance. And so on that, you can already make decisions and organize and improve your portfolio without having that to wait. So there's a lot you can set up, but the scale will only come with harmonization, I think.
And the obvious next question, and I have to ask it, is, do you think we'll see legislation in this field in the same way that we're seeing the CRSD prompt a whole load of disclosure? It's a mandatory requirement. Do you think that will happen?
I mean, there are discussions at this time to make it happen. So I think, France has been really leading the way when it comes to legislation. It's coming to life with, the textile industry. There are discussions about potentially, in some point, making it mandatory as well for food. At the same time, the European Commission is launching directives saying no new environmental labels on the market that we haven't, validated. And so there's a big question mark on where that will come from. But there are discussions at the European level for an eco-labeling. So will it come? We think so, at least in Europe. Yes, we think so.
I mean, that would be my view as well. I was curious to know what you thought.
Yeah.
I just want to check. Hello, lovely audience, sitting there so politely. Does anybody have any questions for these three amazing human beings? It's fine if you don't, because I've got plenty more. I just wanted to. Oh, two. Yeah, right. Gentleman in the back. Do we need? Oh, do we? Yeah, sorry. This is where we have to be hyper collaborative.
Thanks.
Would you say your name as well, please? And
Sure.
your
Yeah.
organisation?
My name is Mitchell Zarati. I'm from Canada. And I've been back and forth from a couple livestock events and some plant and alternative events. And what I hear a lot is that there's this talk about using science. And in here, it's we have science-based, rigorous processes, and it's better than theirs. And it's the opposite in the other pavilions. And so I'm wondering your thoughts on where does this alignment happen, or this this standardized science? What is the converging point where we can actually say, this is the proper methodology, this is the science? And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that.
Richard does.
Great question.
Yeah, really great question. Thank you.
Great question.
Thanks, Mitchell. Look, number one, you've got to have a level of independence in whatever platform you're using. And we all know the debate is raging on, let's take livestock. Let's look it in the eye. A lot of people who think livestock has no place in the food system. And there's a lot of people who say there's no need to change. We just need to incrementally get better. What we're seeing in some of the technology that's coming out already is companies can make active decisions to improve things if they have the right data. So we're seeing companies that, as they look through the data, and I'm sure this is what you do, they can say, if I source my milk or I source my meat ingredients from a different place, I'm going to make a material improvement. It's not Boolean. It's not yes or no, dairy or non-dairy, yes or no, meat or no meat, plant-based or not. It may lean that way, but you can make better decisions already. And I think this is where the Boolean argument gets in the way of let's get that platform that people trust, because organizations make those decisions quickly. And what tends to happen, as in other areas of change, is they look back and think, why didn't we do this earlier? We're not only sourcing more sustainable ingredients, we're improving our margins, we're improving our sales, etc. So I think that the pioneers are starting to do this already because they've moved past the Boolean argument.
Sally, I think you
Yeah.
might have a view on this.
So I completely agree. I think there's two things going on here. One, good data that allows you to reduce your impact, the kind of reductionist view of the world. And then there's the shift piece. And all of it requires good data that somebody says is accurate. Who says it's accurate? It's not my role to say it's accurate at the right source. I look to the experts to establish what that is. And when I look at the shift that needs to happen in the food system, I also look at scientific expertise of the IPCC, who's calling for a shift in consumption patterns, particularly in global north, where we overconsume meat and dairy. And I think there's enough good evidence of that overconsumption. That doesn't mean nobody can ever have anything ever again. The science suggests a shift in the food system and what we need to eat, as well as how it's grown. And the data can do two things. If it's good and robust and transparent, like you say, it helps us with our own climate footprint, scope 1, 2, and 3, prioritize our own actions, both on where we source from, the partners we source from, which ingredients and materials and supply chains and farmers we're going to work with to shift practice, to have better practice. It helps us identify hotspots in that. So strange hotspots come out in some of our work, particularly when we started to look at methane within that context, both in terms of the methane impact of some of our ingredients and therefore what we need to drive in terms of rapid action now, because we know how important methane is. Then the bigger question of the food system shift has to come in. So how do we use the data in comparison for the consumer and for policymakers and for others to allow us to identify which of these products are not just high carbon, high land use, high water consumption, and on balance, when you look at it, the majority of animal and dairy products, so meat and dairy products, have higher consumption rate or greenhouse gases, for land use, for the resources that we're trying to protect when we think about climate, nature, human health. So finding a way to use good life cycle assessment data that allows us to compare within boundaries, fundamentally important within the system to drive some of those policy decisions. But that I'm thinking from a systems perspective rather than necessarily an upfield perspective. When we do, it's not me saying that's the right data. It's that the computer says no discussion. We've gone to a set of experts that tell us where the tolerances are around what we can claim with the data that's readily available and comparable against a set of really common standards.
Really quick, Charlotte. Anything to add?
I wanted just to add one thing because I think that's important. Right now, we have a world which, in general, is trying to polarize topics. It's either this or that, and I think that's a big risk. The reality is that environmental science is new and evolving. I mean, climate is getting better and better, and has been for quite some time now. But you look at, water risks, you look at biodiversity loss. All of these are very nascent ways of being studied. They're not nascent topics, but the way we measure them is quite nascent. And at the end of the day, I think no matter what the data looks at, or does, or is precise or not precise perfectly, is granular at the right level and so on, the key things that need to happen in a food system transition, we know them. And so I think that the way we need to look at this is where can we act already, knowing that, yes, things are going to evolve. Yes, that environmental footprint, that carbon footprint is uncertain. I can tell you no carbon footprint Qantas ever made was perfect, nor was it, precise, perfectly granular and so on. But it gives you the direction, and that direction is clear. And I actually think it's not either plant-based or livestock. It's a mix of both. A regenerative system does require some livestock in it to be able to completely perform, but not at the pace that we're seeing intensive, very heavy livestock, happening. So that's the thing that I think is just risky when we go into that polarizing debate. We know the key actions.
I couldn't agree more. I think, we do ourselves disservice when we enter into binary decision making. So we've just got a minute left, and I wanted to try and summarize this discussion, if I may. So I've been listening really hard, and I've managed to harvest tips for effective labeling, and they spell label.
Oh, very good.
Are you ready for
That's
this?
brilliant.
So, L is for label as part of a broader behavior change campaign. That point was made very clearly. A is for activate a 360 brand campaign to provide the context. A label on its own doesn't really do enough. And also that brand campaign will also be context specific, will look different according to geography. B is to beware of the carbon tunnel. So I love what you're saying, Sally, about also have a conversation about land, about water. E is elevate the scientific underpinning. That will give us a scalable system, will allow harmonization. And then L, final L, I couldn't decide between L for less is more. Keep it simple. L could also be for life cycle data. We need that strong underpinning of data. But L also could be for legislation, because I think it's going to come. So there you go. 6 tips for effective labeling, things for us to take away from this discussion. We've actually got 30 seconds. So what I'd love to hear from each of you in turn, you've probably got about 7 seconds. If you have a magic wand, the one thing that you would like to see happen next in this whole evolution of environmental labeling. Sally.
Oh my goodness, that's on the spot. The legislation side. So I'd love to see the harmonisation that allows us to show in a completely legitimate fashion how much better plant-based is than dairy to shift the consumer fast.
Brilliant. Model answer in terms of length.
There you go.
Convergence around an alliance to build trust.
Eat.
I have to go with harmonization. I've been saying it all along. So yeah.
Perfect. We're at time. So thank you very much for your contributions, and thank you, audience. Thank you for the question. And well, let's hope it's not another 17 years before I have another conversation about environmental labeling, because I do honestly believe if you look at how systemic change happens, it's a lever that is really underpulled and we need to pull it. So thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.